I've been a fan of Secret of Mana and Trials of Mana for a long time. In fact, when I was a kid, my cousin James got me into a bunch of old games like Chrono Trigger, as well as Secret of Mana and Seiken Densetsu 3.
It shows you
Oh my gosh.
It's open.
Okay, I just want to comment, guys. I can't move backwards or leftwards or right.
Or leftwards.
I can only move forwards.
Well, that's at least more control than the cutscene there.
I mean, this is true. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for these games, but they fell into a bit of a dark age in terms of new releases, and I had not really branched out. That is until I played Adventures of Mana in 2016 and started Sword of Mana in 2017, only to drop it. A lot of stuff was happening with a move that took 2 years to complete, alongside a bunch of other drama that happened along the way. Now recently I picked up Sword of Mana again, and when I did eventually beat it, I left quite a few tweets on Twitter. And then I found myself playing more and more Mana games afterwards and feeling a need to talk about them. So rather than make a bunch of tweets, why not just make reviews? So today I'm going to be talking about the original 3 Mana games, all featured on the collection of Mana for Nintendo Switch, as well as the remakes of the first 2 games. Are you ready? Then it's time for us to depart into the world of Mana.
Genma, you're telling me that you're showing a Final Fantasy game in a Mana video?
Oh boy, the amount of times I've had to explain this one. So yes, even though this is called Final Fantasy Adventures, this game is actually the very first Mana game. See, in Japan this game is called Final Fantasy Gaiden Seiken Densetsu, which roughly translates to Final Fantasy Side Story: The Legend of the Holy Sword. And in Japan, the series is known as the Seiken Densetsu series, not the Mana series. Following me so far? Alright, well let's continue. Now, in more recent years, Final Fantasy Adventures got a 1-to-1 remake for the Vita and phones called Adventures of Mana, which is going to be the version I'll be talking about here. While the remake is kind of cheap looking, I personally prefer it to the original's black and white graphics, and because of a couple quality of life changes. Now, even though I mentioned it earlier, I will not be talking about the other remake, Sword of Mana, for a number of reasons. The main reason is the remake is so drastically different from the original that it would honestly be too many changes to really talk about in this video, so I will save that for a different video entirely. Now, from this gameplay, I'm sure you're already thinking this, but the game is very reminiscent of Zelda, and in fact the way the game is structured is like a more linear version of Zelda 1. You have a basic swing/weapon attack, and you pick up different weapons that are used to progress throughout the game. Personally though, I really did not have a very pleasant time with this game, and I remember getting pretty bored or lost on a regular basis. The game has a serious case of what I like to call Link's Awakening syndrome, where you run into a progression gate that follows really weird logic. Early in the game, you are told you have to escort the female protagonist Fuji to Wendell. Simple enough, right? Well, you get to Wendell, you have to go through this cave. After going through the cave, you are stuck in an area where the only place you can go is this creepy mansion. The music in the butler in this mansion set off quite a few red flags, but hey, we decided to stay there anyway, why not? Sure. Oh look, Fuji got kidnapped. You talk to the butler, but it does nothing, so you proceed to talk to the NPCs who mention something about monsters and a marsh, and that they might have a key to a cellar. Sure. Why they have the key to the cellar? I don't know, I didn't design the game. So you go outside the mansion to kill some lizards to get a key. That takes you to the cellar. At the end of that cellar, you fight a dragon that gives you a mirror that can reveal the butler is not actually a butler, but is in fact a furry. After fighting him, you are then able to progress and save Fuji, but again, this progression is just weird. Much later in the game, after the halfway point, the game opens up significantly, but also not really. The game wants you to still follow a linear sequence, but it lets you run around and discover all the dead ends. I have personally never been a fan of this sort of game design because all it really accomplishes is getting the player lost and frustrated, unless they happen to have a guide on hand. Alright, so this part's kind of off script, but I wasn't really sure where to put it. But I think one of my favorite parts about this game was a pet chocobo that you find very early on in the game. It hatches in front of you and it's super adorable and you get to ride it around everywhere. And then towards the end of the game, they gave him robot legs and then you get to basically ride on top of water and stuff. It is super fun and really quirky and I really like it. While the exploration can be kind of convoluted, the gameplay by itself is not actually the worst thing in the world. While the dungeons are pretty basic, I can get some enjoyment out of exploring them and doing the small puzzles inside. You have Mattocks that are basically bombs from Zelda, and the game has the nice Zelda feature where breakable walls make a different sound when you hit them. Of course, this means there's item management, which is made far easier in the remake because you have a whopping 4 shortcuts for spells/items, making the pace go by much faster. Although my least favorite part of the dungeons is the music. Look, I'm no music major, so I really can't describe this, but it's just something compositionally that drives me crazy with these songs, and it makes me want to get out of the dungeons as fast as I can. Although I think the dungeon themes suck, I think the town themes are actually pretty nice. Now, after looking at some interviews, it's actually kind of interesting how at the time one of the major points this game tried to push was having an action RPG with a good story. And being fair, when I look at the Final Fantasy games and other RPGs released at the time, I can definitely say they succeeded. But does it hold up? Nope! The story is honestly pretty undercooked and really lacking in enough build-up to make the story impactful as a whole. But there are some really good moments sprinkled throughout, such as this one girl who is bitten by a Gorgon and is going to turn into one, and allows you to use her blood to save her brother who is turned into a parakeet. Yeah, I don't know. And then you are forced to kill her so she won't transform, which is honestly a really sad moment and really sticks with you. There's a whole lot of deaths in this game too. I really can't stress that enough. This game is actually really dark. Now, even though there's all these little moments spread throughout, the game is just so archaic in its delivery that it's really hard for you to get behind the story in many of these instances. As a whole, I think this game is an alright first step in the series, but I really don't see myself coming back to this anytime soon, if ever. While I don't hate the combat, there really isn't enough interesting there, and there's actually a lot of clunkiness in general to the way the game plays. The music is hit or miss, and while I enjoy the story on paper, the delivery just doesn't hold up. But this is the game that would be forgotten because the real adventure is about to start. Released 2 years later, following a turbulent development period, Secret of Mana was released and blew many people away with its visuals, music, unique combat, and storytelling. No longer was the Mana series a Zelda clone. Now the series had its own flow, featuring a run button, stamina management, and a more intuitive magic system, playable party members, and co-op. It was insane. To many people, probably because of the name change, this was the first Mana game. And this is also because aesthetically it is where the series distanced itself from Final Fantasy. Now what do I think of the game? I like it, but I think it has some problems. See, there are many people who consider this game one of Square's best RPGs alongside games like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII, a classic. While I actually like this game quite a lot and agree it's a classic, I feel it's not in the way that games like Chrono Trigger are. See, with Chrono Trigger, that game, to this day, is one of the best examples of an RPG. It has excellent pacing, great and simplistic combat, a story that holds up insanely well years later, and in general, if you gave someone a copy of that game, they'd very likely have a great time. Secret of Mana has not aged the same way. Now, if you put it into perspective with games like Link to the Past, Super Metroid, and Final Fantasy, it is actually quite impressive that they got this combat going with the level of graphics they have on display. But if you played any action RPG since Secret of Mana, such as Kingdom Hearts or any of these other games, you might find the combat kind of odd. Personally, I am not a fan of the stamina meter. In short terms, when you go to attack, this meter on the bottom of the screen drops to 0 and slowly fills up. If you choose to attack before it is full, you will do a percentage of your max damage based off how high it refilled. This was created to basically discourage frequently attacking. On the one hand, it means you aren't spamming buttons like in other action RPGs, but on the other hand, the entire combat becomes dictated by this system. Magic, on the other hand, is pretty simple. You open up a menu, select a spell, and it fires off with no major cooldown, really. As long as you have MP, you can use magic. Unfortunately, you don't really learn this for the first 3 to 4 hours of the game, which is honestly the roughest part of the game every single time I go to replay it. The problem with the combat is damage kind of stacks. See, in a normal game, if you get hit, you take knockback and have invincibility frames to get up and get out of the way. In Secret of Mana, every attack hits and then loads in order, meaning you can get wombo comboed by enemies, and in certain scenarios this can be insanely frustrating. This can also happen if an enemy decides to rapid fire spells, which if you're unlucky and underleveled, can lead to death pretty quick. Thing is, this is also true of enemies. Although it can be hard to figure out when their invincibility frames activate, with magic you kind of obliterate most enemies with little trouble. Magic is a double-edged sword because it does a great job for making up for the problems with the melee combat, but it teeters to the other extreme where it fires out so fast and so hard that it destroys everything. I suppose this is made up for by the restoratives being rather expensive, especially if you get them from Nico the price gouging cat. Hate this guy. The camera can also be a huge problem for various reasons. Every playable character has to be on screen at all times, which means that if a character gets stuck, you have to switch to them and move them around. This also does not center the camera on the main character, making it insanely easy to run right into enemies and get blindsided. I like the story quite a bit, but it's also got some problems. Ignoring the fact that the intro was taken directly from Final Fantasy VI, which was also released around this time, the game also had an insane rush job of a localization. In the English release, most of the main character's lines were cut for some reason, and because of this I've seen some people interpret the main character Randy as this rough jerk of a character, but he's actually kind of a goofball everyman, as you can tell in the remake. There are also still parts of the game I love to this day, such as Pandora, a city that has fallen under some sort of soul-stealing spell, and you can just tell by entering that there is something horribly wrong with the song Phantom in a Rose playing in the background. The soundtrack was done by Hiroki Kikuta, who is honestly my favorite composer of all time. He has only composed a handful of games, such as Secret of Mana, Trials of Mana, and most recently Indivisible, but in particular his tracks from Secret of Mana are legendary. If you sat down and talked to a Secret of Mana fan, I want you to time it and see how long it takes for them to bring up the soundtrack. Recently though, the game got a remake and it was controversial for all sorts of reasons. It brought back the engine used for Adventures of Mana, and while it had voice acting, the cinematics were cheap to say the least.
Visit Sage Luca in the Water Palace. The sage has protected these lands for over 200 years. You would do well to listen to her advice.
Hey! The Elder wants you to come to his house.
While they added in these cute Tales-esque in-skits, they really did not alter the story much, which is really the part of the game I also think needed a bit more changing. They did streamline magic so you could hotkey them rather than using menus, and also gave you more free reign in terms of combat. In fact, in terms of gameplay, I'd say it's a lot more accessible than the original. The one area that has people divided is the soundtrack. There are some tracks that recreate the original atmosphere perfectly, and then there are some that just... Supposedly, they only got Kikuta in time for him to compose 11 of these arrangements, and they are some of the best ones in the game, while the rest were finished up by other people. Also, some things that the remake fixed inherently that makes the experience a lot more fun for new players is stuff that I complained about previously. So, for example, the camera now will snap directly to whatever character you're controlling, and it no longer requires everyone to be on screen at all times. Co-op is still completely intact and honestly is probably a lot more fun now than it used to be. And in general, attacking enemies and dodging them is honestly a lot easier to do since it seems they turn down the aggressiveness of a lot of enemies. I'm sure for old school players, this is probably going to seem kind of toned down difficulty-wise, but I think for the most part this is a really positive change because, again, I am very convinced the original game might have been a little bit too mean to the player at points, so in general I think the game is much more fair in the remake. It's up to you which version you want to play, but it's hard to say which version is 100% better than the other. Honestly, with the remake, I feel like it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. The other thing with the remake is it is also insanely expensive, around $40, which honestly, given the graphical quality and the very little changes to the gameplay, as much as I like the inclusion of voice acting and these other features, it honestly is not worth that price tag. You could get the Mana Collection on Nintendo Switch for around the same price and have all 3 of the games I'm talking about in this video, and honestly, I think they really should lower the price in the future. Maybe if it gets into a collection or if you can find it on sale, I could recommend it, but for now, the original version plays just fine. Now that all is said and done, it's up to you which version of the game you want to play. But honestly, I think Secret of Mana is a really good game, and it actually left a really strong legacy. Compared to a bunch of other action RPGs, this game is really famous in terms of what it did for the industry and action RPGs in general. However, I would say that the game has not exactly aged the best. It doesn't exactly live up to that legend of the name itself. That said, I think the game is still perfectly fine, especially if you have friends to play co-op with, and it is definitely accessible. If you have the collection of mana, I think you'll have a great time. Get a friend, convince them to sit down with you as you play through the game, and I think you'll just enjoy the entire experience. If you do want to play the remake, it is very good, although it is insanely expensive, so it's kind of hard to recommend. Either way, it's up to you which way you want to go ahead and play the game. And yeah, now that Secret Mana is out of the way, it's time for Trials of Mana, baby! First off, I want to give a huge thank you to Square Enix for finally giving this game an English translation. For years, us fans have known this game as Seiken Densetsu 3 because it was never released outside of Japan. But thanks to methods, us fans were finally able to experience the game and find out that it's actually better than Secret of Mana in almost every single way. This game is insanely replayable and features a cast of 6 different playable characters, with 3 different routes that are decided by whoever you made your main character. Alongside your main character, you can also choose 2 other characters to be your party members. The story of Trials of Mana is quite a bit more complex and developed than Secret of Mana, as each of these characters are part of one of 6 major cities across the world: Valsina, Altina, Laurent, Navarro, Ferolia, and Wendell. No matter who you pick, a majority of the adventure is the same, but towards the end of the game branches off into their own final areas, where you will receive different pieces of exposition and world building. If you thought this was the only thing that adds replayability to the game, well, guess what? There's the class system. Each character is given 2 promotions, and with each promotion you can choose a light or dark path. This means you can have up to tons of different party combinations. You can choose Reese as a character and give her the light class so she can buff your team, or a dark class so she can debuff your enemies. With Durin, you can promote him down the light path and gain access to a shield and healing magic, or the dark path and be able to learn elemental magic to efficiently take down bosses. The customization, on top of the ability to have multiple final areas, gives tons of incentive to experiment with different characters and try different routes. My only problem with this system being the 2nd tier class, where you need to farm rare item drops from enemies to be able to promote. If you're using some form of save states, this isn't too much of a problem, but going without that can honestly be pretty obnoxious, and on top of that, the item you get is also kind of random. But as for the game itself, it is a massive improvement. The gameplay takes more cues from beat-em-up action games where you use basic attacks to fill up a meter, and then you can knock them back with super strong attacks. It's simple but insanely satisfying to play. Also returning in this game is co-op from Secret of Mana, and having played this game with my friend Ash on stream, we had a blast playing it. Went down south, it would take us towards the castle. We don't want to go there. We want to go this way.
Yeah, we want to fight corgis.
These are really not corgis.
They really are.
They are not corgis.
Look at them.
They're not corgis. Dude, have you seen a corgi?
Wait. Oh no, it's slightly off screen.
I think.
First of all, yes, I've seen a corgi.
They're very tiny. Those are not tiny.
Get the big corgis. Alright.
Corgis also have like really pudgy physiques. Those are more like the average dog.
They're fit corgis, alright? I don't know what you want me to tell you.
No, corgis are thick. I'm saying these ones aren't thick,
No,
therefore
no,
they
fit.
aren't corgi.
Fit.
Fit. Okay, I thought you said thick.
Wait, what's the difference? First of all,
He wants the thick
I'm not
corgi.
calling him thick.
The music is once again done by Hiroki Kikuta, and while this soundtrack is not as iconic as Secret of Mana, I love this soundtrack a lot more. It's darker, more intense, and really helps amp up the fun of fighting things. There's this snare drum instrument that plays in like every song, and it sounds like a hand being slammed against a wall, and it just really pumps me up. For real, this soundtrack is amazing and really cemented Kikuta's style, which you can hear to this day, even in titles like Indivisible, which is probably my favorite OST of his to date. The graphics got an insane glow up from Secret of Mana and really pushed the Super Nintendo to its limits. Yeah, that's right, this is a Super Nintendo game, and supposedly a large reason they didn't localize this game was due to concerns of the game crashing due to extra space being used by the English text, as there were technical issues even in the original Japanese version. Overall, I love this game, and it's not only my favorite Mana game, but one of my favorite games ever. I am so hyped for that remake, man. Can Square release it already? I want it so bad! Alright, so originally in this video I was going to include the other Mana games, but I figured it would take a lot of time to really do, and I wanted to get this review out in time for the Trials of Mana remake. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I am planning to do a Let's Play of Trials of Mana, and I'm super looking forward to that game. I love the original, and I'm really excited from what I've seen of the remake. And in general, I hope whatever Mana games they make next take really good ideas from these games. And I do plan to actually cover the rest of the Mana series, albeit probably not right away because I do want to finish Trials of Mana first. However, I think it would be really fun to go through all these games and look at what's good and what's bad, because I've kind of heard almost nothing about a lot of these spin-offs, and I figured I'd draw some attention to them because I have played a few, and some of them are really good, some of them not so good, but I think it'll be worth talking about. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a like, all that jazz. You guys know at this point how that works. Seriously, thank you all for watching so much. See you later. Have a nice day. Take care. And yeah, see you next time. Bye.